Hello and welcome everybody to our Bright Talk today. We are going to be talking about AI versus ransomware today, the before and during and after of an actual cyber incident involving ransomware and how AI plays a role, and sort of walk through some of the ways you can use this to essentially work your defenses a little bit better, and some of the ways you can improve incident response and ways to think about cyber solutions with AI within them. Quick housekeeping note, we just want you to be aware of some of the interactivity with this Bright Talk. So there's an ability to ask questions at the bottom. There's 3 buttons. There's also an ability for you to rate the webinar, as well as a button for resources, which are some of the leave behinds that we're going to have as part of this webinar that you, of course, can take with you and hopefully find value and help you improve your cybersecurity. All right, just get to the agenda here. Quick introductions. Then, of course, we're going to talk about 3 very salient ransomware stories. Then we're going to talk about why AI is actually pretty well suited for certain cybersecurity problems. And then we're going to go specifically into how before, during, and after an actual cyber incident, what the 2 different approaches are from an insurance perspective with our partner Measured here, as well as how we do it with managed detection and response. We're then going to open it up after resources to a polling question, and as well, we're going to start to do open Q&A. So feel free to ask questions all the way throughout the webinar. We will get to those at the end. All right, a bit about myself, 15 plus years, basically since 2005, been in cybersecurity at CISO now with ActZero. Had built a number of different security operations center components, and also the creator of the Intelligo platform, which was acquired by ActZero. So, working with certified ethical hacking certifications amongst many others now, entire idea is to sort of use my career and knowledge to help find and stop cyber threats. Joining me today, Atya, advisory and board member at Zala Technology. He's been consulting in the insurance space, cyber insurance space, with a focus on cybersecurity for nearly a decade now. He's been building cyber insurance products, contributing to liability programs at Victor Insurance, the market's first cyber warranty product. And he also holds a BSc from Cybersecurity Management and Policy. Welcome to the webinar, and thank you for being with us, Zach.
Thanks for having me. And we're talking about a couple of topics I really enjoy, cybersecurity and AI. So let's get into it.
Awesome. Let's start with both of our perspectives here on ransomware stories. We've heard a lot about these stories. Time to just sort of deconstruct them. If you had not heard about these stories, here's a quick recap. There was a company called Kaseya, which does sort of remote management technology for platforms where you want to install patches and configure help desk sort of things. And they were alerted in June of 2021 by some Dutch researchers about vulnerabilities in their product that they just simply didn't patch in time. That basically turned into one of the largest cyber attacks that we've seen. That was taken over by the Revil ransomware group, and about 1,500 of their downstream companies were impacted by ransomware. Shortly after that, you heard a couple of different news stories about how the Department of Justice had actually seized $6.1 million from both Ukrainian and Russian nationalist and actors as part of this. And so when you think about this attack, it was probably considered widely as one of the what we call supply chain attacks now, which are becoming more popular. And it was just impressive because of the scale and scope of how they were able to pull this off. Now, of course, as the MDR company, the way we saw this was to be able to adapt to the fact that most of the customers couldn't necessarily quickly switch this off, right? And many of them were caught by surprise because this attack was basically done in very, very short order, right, to all of those systems. So, of course, even Kaseya themselves reacting by, taking down, certain cloud systems in time. So very quick notices had to go out to customers as to what was actually happening, whether or not our service could actually find and block these types of attacks. Luckily, with our agent, we had the capabilities to, dynamically adapt to some of the ransomware attacks that were coming through there and protect a few of our customers that were using Kaseya. And that's what we saw. Zach, what do you what have you seen from this cyber attack?
Yeah, I mean, in the cyber insurance space, we're always looking for patching cadence as an indicator of good cyber hygiene. And Kaseya was a little bit different because it wasn't up to the end clients to have to provide those up or to make those updates. So this is a little bit more upstream with Kaseya, and they just couldn't get there in time, whether they dragged their feet or whether they actually were actively working on it and just couldn't get there in time. What this brought to light in the cyber insurance industry was taking a look at your vendors and vetting them a little bit more closely, maybe having some procedures in place for how to vet your vendors so that you know exactly what you're getting into, you understand that they have good patching cadence, and you're doing a little bit of risk management from a procedural standpoint.
Awesome. Yeah. And we're going to talk a little bit later about how AI could play a role in detecting or where AI plays a role in a cyber attack, much like this. Next up is the Hafnium Group, a nation-state sponsored group within China. Depending on who you ask, whether it's Bloomberg, Palo Alto Networks, Brian Krebs, you have anywhere from 18,000, 30,000, 125,000 different exchange servers worldwide that were affected by this group who exploited a number of different remote code execution vulnerabilities. Of course, you can't mention this without mentioning Orange Sign, his disclosure of these vulnerabilities to Microsoft, and of course Velocity, who kind of broke the story in terms of the exploit code that they showed you could access, everything from mailboxes to deploying web shells, which could allow you to do much worse to the rest of the network through Exchange. And so, a lot of people in the community are sort of under the understanding that this may be linked to that SolarWinds breach we'd heard even earlier. So a supply chain breach hitting a pretty big supplier and their source code getting leaked, which makes it easier and easier for some of these vulnerabilities to bypass the traditional patching window because they're discovered by, of course, outside attackers. And so one of the things that we want to talk about a little bit is, when they did deploy the web shell, does machine learning play a role in that? Do you have an ability in your managed detection and response provider when somebody goes through the web shell to actively block it? And we did have a number of customers who had seen this exploit, right? There was 4 patches overall, and 3 of them had sort of been publicly disclosed, but they just kept sort of saying Hafnium, and a lot of them sort of under this confusing blanket of, are we already patched, or is this a new thing, or is this still ongoing? And then that very uncomfortable period where we knew there was a 4th vulnerability, there was no patch, and of course people were starting to see exploits from it, right? And so you have this period of time where you couldn't necessarily get rid of Exchange. People couldn't move to the cloud in less than an hour, kind of thing, right? They had these investments, and so it became a very sticky situation from a vulnerability disclosure perspective, and therefore a great advantage on the court for machine learning in this case to dynamically adapt to the exploits coming through this type of attack through the Exchange server. Zach, on your side, what are some of the highlights from the insurance perspective on Hafnium and this exploit?
So one thing that we did see was that a lot of the breaches were affecting a little bit more larger size companies. So when you think about the SMB space, you're really thinking about that true like middle market, maybe even getting into the larger enterprise space, since they typically tend to employ the use of Exchange servers on-prem. There was a knee-jerk reaction from the industry overall. I mean, we have brought on a lot of new clients that were actually just axed from their previous cyber insurance carrier just because they had Exchange servers. So we didn't really think that was fair. I mean, there's a good bit of background story on how you can actually prepare yourself to continue to get cyber insurance. One is making sure that you have those patches deployed in your Exchange servers. And unfortunately, we're still seeing claims in the space on organizations that are being having those exploits in their Exchange servers due to being unpatched. So please patch your Exchange servers, and it's going to be a prerequisite for a lot of these cyber insurance carriers, including Measured. I mean, we ask for those. We ask and ensure that you're making those patches and those updates so that we can provide you the risk transfer that you need.
Yeah, that's awesome advice. Certainly patch as much as you can. That'll definitely keep the low-hanging Exchange server out of the hands of others. Of course, everything from geofiltering and other things were recommendations we were making. Cutting off OWA became a thing for people as part of this to not lend themselves to the exploit. And of course, having a next-gen capability to adapt to whatever they put through that, right? Because while we're sitting here, sort of on round number 4 with this, there's likely going to be a 5 and a 6 and a 7. And so you never necessarily know just how far those source code leaks may have led to a whole bunch of new 0 days that can kind of exploit at will. So very salient, points all around for this one. And of course, for the next one on the Colonial Pipeline attack, very different. So the first one, right, Kaseya taking advantage of access to a SaaS provider that already had access to tens of thousands of machines, right, leveraging a very popular tool in the case of Hafnium on Exchange, which you couldn't necessarily just turn off. You can't just stop email because there's a cyber risk. So people scrambling to figure out what an acceptable level of use would be. And in this one, sort of the subtleties are what really make a difference here. It's small problems becoming very big ones very quickly, right? In this particular attack, the dark side group, which depending on how you view these attack groups naming conventions, and is this still REvil? Is it partially REvil? Are there more members, less members? Who are these guys? Did they rebrand? You basically have a group taking responsibility in some way for this that basically accessed a Cisco VPN without MFA on it with stolen credentials somewhere in the very vast, Colonial Pipeline environment. And then, of course, just days before, or I should say the day before, the attack, exfiltrating hundreds of gigabytes of data to essentially, when they start launching their extortion campaign to get Bitcoin from this company, they have the data to sort of prove it, right? We've got your stuff. You want it back. We can give it to you. Interestingly enough, when they did pay the ransom, which was 75 Bitcoins at the time, worth somewhere between $4 and $5 million, and eventually the FBI believing to have recovered 2.3 in terms of Bitcoin seizures, you also had the premise that when they did get this software, it was actually slower than their actual BCP plan to restore the service. So they didn't actually even rely on the decryptor that they paid for. They restored their images in their BCP plan with an alternate method, right, to keep operations up and running. Now, even though this effect didn't have a lasting downtime for Colonial Pipeline themselves, and they had, not seen a shortage in gasoline, they had created a panic. The news story broke pretty wide, and within a few days, you start to see people filling up jerry cans of gas and liters and liters and liters all over the suspected regions that would have a gas shortage, right? And so not only did we see the fallout of rising gas prices, which in retrospect, sitting here in Q1 2022, Q2 2022, very high gas prices compared to even this run up. So not as dramatic as it could have been, but certainly also showing that this was an extremely popular group. This wasn't just whale hunting for a large business. The Bitcoin seizures and some analytics that they had after the attack showed that over $90 million was in the Bitcoin wallets associated with this attack group, and that they likely had over 2,000 or so victims, most of which were small to medium businesses that basically didn't have the capability for the FBI to negotiate their ransom because they were smaller teams, right? Now, this was a big story, of course, machine learning here. We're going to talk about, user behavior and what if that one account comes into that one VPN and starts moving through your PowerShell scripts to get to that critical database. Or what stage does machine learning even apply here? We'll get to that in just a minute. But before we do that, Zach, stories from this one. This was a big one. I mean, liability all over the place here. How did you see this from the insurance perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the big takeaways from the Colonial Pipeline attack was that VPN is no longer the saving grace for remote access. I mean, you really need to have your VPN secured by MFA. Now it's a bottom line prerequisite for really anyone getting cyber insurance these days. I would challenge anyone on this call to try to find cyber insurance without having MFA of any form employed. So we look for it, remote access at a bare minimum. Obviously, looking at it from securing your email or securing your backups with MFA. MFA across the board is highly recommended. It's not a panacea, right? I mean, there's still session jacking that exists. I mean, there's a lot of other ways you can purchase cookies on the dark web for $10 to try to get into your organization. But in the very least, at this point in time, one thing is here to stay in the cyber insurance industry is the requirement of MFA. And the last thing I would say is, I mean, there's a lot of small and mid-sized businesses that were affected by this group, and a lot of times these groups prioritize quantity over quality of attacks. It's just easier. It's a low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, not to mention the fact that they started to get pretty famous pretty quickly. I think they wanted to be famous, but not this famous. Of course, the various statements from President Biden over the course of this story, saying even if it's not nation state sponsored, if you don't shut them down, we will. which begged the question, why did you shut them down before? But you also have the concept of the recovery aspect of this, where they went and chased the Bitcoin wallets to try to disrupt the finances, right? And so you look at these attacks and you think, after the horse leaves the barn, a lot of these things just sort of cascade in terms of how expensive they get, almost geometrically, it seems, from this story, right? Even though you may have done the right things to recover, even though you paid the ransom, and frankly, you only had that one VPN. So when you look at Colonial Pipeline security posture overall, it's not like they were sitting there with a Windows 2003 network and just never upgraded, or they weren't aware of the exchange attacks, or they didn't have a response plan, or they didn't recover, frankly, quicker than recovering the ransomware. It's that things just escalated very, very quickly, and so the proactive measures and the ability to prevent were also a big part of keeping things contained in this story. Now we're going to go to a more academic part of the talk here, where we're going to start to talk about AI, specifically machine learning, and how it helps solve cybersecurity problems, not just for cybersecurity technology like endpoint protection or SIMs or data analytics to find attacks as they happen, but even before and after the attacks, and whether they play a decent role there, as well as how obviously AI is incorporated into things like cyber insurance, where you're calculating the cost of these premiums and the loss ratios that come involved in deciding how much it costs to even get cyber insurance, or how much you're owed when something like that happens. Something that Zach said I thought was kind of good was, if you can get cyber insurance without MFA, I would argue that even if you did, what's the likelihood that that company's going to be able to pay if their policy is that weak now, right? It's likely not high, right? You see a lot of people even ditching their programs because they're just not profitable, right? So let's get into it. Nice seeing my chart for those of you on the call that had been on other webinars with me. When I usually talk about machine learning and where it applies in cybersecurity, I usually like to bring up this graph. It is a Gartner graph that basically allows you to almost take like a SWOT analysis of the different capabilities where you could use machine learning in the data sets specifically collected by cyber technology, endpoints, SIMs, network technology, cloud technology, and then how you could use those technologies, data sets, right, the fields and then records that you're getting from those tools, and turn it into cyber actions, right, cyber detections. And so if you look at these numbered aspects in this grid, right, what you're really looking at is top to bottom in terms of business value, the best place to apply machine learning. And so you see things like file-based malware detection, right? In the case of something like a zero-day ransomware attack that's coming to you as a file, right, it would be really helpful to understand, if they injected a process, that this file is now acting like malware, right? It's acting like ransomware. Also, if it's something that is coming through memory, maybe your browser or Kaseya is something that is actually doing the encryption, right? And so in those other stories, when you look at number 3, right, process behavior analysis is also important, because maybe Chrome isn't supposed to encrypt everything on your disk, or maybe Kaseya is not supposed to delete all your files, right? And so you have these really good places where you can quickly use structured data to identify something that's malicious and block it, right? And then as you go down this grid, you start to see things like number 19, where people start to apply machine learning to places that don't really have a lot of business value. And so you think about things like risk posture scoring, or whether this vulnerability is the most important vulnerability to remove. And of course, when you think about the dividends from that, or the returns on doing that, they're quite low compared to the other places that actually help you a lot more, right? They also are probably cheaper, right? So one more expensive with little draw versus the other ones that are better business value. Now, of course, I'm not here to sort of debate every single one of these and say that. We can. So I would take a good long look at this chart, ask me any detailed questions you want, even if it's just to test my skill on what these things even are and how it works. That could be fun later. But moving on to the farmer's market here, I want to talk a little bit about structured versus unstructured data, just to deconstruct the story of machine learning as a subset of AI that can be used in cyber technology now, right? As a lot of people who follow, machine learning, maybe you have people in school, or you're thinking about going back for, data science. Is this the time to get into, machine learning? What are we even doing in that discipline? How can that be applied to cyber and other places? And so the concept is that, when you look at data in the organization, there's a couple of different places you can get it, right? There's structured data, usually coming in the form of things that we in cyber technology have been consuming for a long time, right? System logs, Windows events, the EDR data that basically says in succinct key value pairs, right? This user is Adam, and this workstation is workstation 1, and this login, this event is login ID 145. So that means that this is a login event with success attached to it, right? Those are the kinds of structured data sources that we're used to consuming. And just so happens that the reason we keep talking about machine learning in cyber is that this is actually a very efficient place to deploy machine learning, right? It's quick to search, it's quick to consume, it's ripe for the type of models and building of detections or rules or predictive analysis that's coming out of machine learning using these structured data sets, right? And then you have unstructured data. And this typically comes up when you're starting to talk about things that typically don't follow a similar pattern, right? If you think about, your file share and the idea that you have emails and everybody writes a very different kind of email, right? I probably use, instead of YOU, I use you, despite, people sort of trying to correct me on that. Or I may use documents that are Word or Excel, or maybe I use GDocs, right? And so the concept is that, those are sort of HTML. They may seem like they have a structure, but they don't follow any particular like record type value, right? And as a result, they're a little bit harder to work with when you're trying to do searches, when you're trying to build sort of analytics and aggregate data into trees of is if it's this user and then this device and then this happens with this process, then usually that looks like malware. Whereas something like if somebody writes a Word document and they have a macro in it, is that good or bad? Well, what is the macro? It's big unstructured set of scripts. It's source code. It's going to be hard to analyze and say that source code, unless it's running and changing that file, is really malware, right? So that's kind of the relationship to structured and unstructured data. Of course, there are volumes more to the aspects of machine learning, but it's important to understand where it applies at the very least, right? So that when you're starting to hear stories from vendors or others about machine learning and what it can do, know that it's very hard to do something with unstructured data, and therefore it probably has a very low efficiency, very low value, probably very low returns on your investment, right? So look for structured data when you're trying to apply these things. The other thing is the concept of variability, right? What you're really looking for in terms of how the data should be analyzed. I want to make sure that people understand that when we talk about AI patterns at scale, right, there's a very many different, under the machine learning bucket, ways that you can choose to analyze things, right? There's supervised and unsupervised. And every time you go on Udemy and try to learn what this stuff is, they usually enter the space with that and then say, okay, well, you'll probably get to selection via proxy and all these other technical terms for, what approach works best for analysis in predictions, what's better at determining anomalies, what's better at, dealing with structured data, unstructured data, what's better at dealing in speed and volume and those kinds of things. And so it's very important to understand that while people like to split hairs like that, there's a lot of shortcuts you can probably take in terms of how data should be analyzed, and understand that you're likely going to already have data in cybersecurity in the structured way. So like, what do you already have and what are you trying to do with it, right? You're trying to make predictions on whether something's malware. Okay, can you do those things? As opposed to trying to say, well, is there a magical way that I can determine something like user behavior or what risk I have based on how people are using unstructured data? Likely not, right? And so, simply try not to dig in too deeply on the internal technical details, but instead level up to say, okay, well, what data are they consuming? How are they going to be using it? Are things mature enough at this point in time, specifically in cyber, to actually do something with that? Now, of course, it wouldn't really matter if I gave you a complete professorial, view of machine learning. I'm not even qualified to probably talk about it any more than that high level that I am. So we are going to focus right now on use cases specifically within the company where people who have dialed in on this way more than me have spent time, as well as looking at it from an insurance perspective. So we're going to focus on those 3 ransomware attacks, right? The Kaseya attack, the Colonial Pipeline attack, and of course, the Hafnium group through Exchange. And we're going to talk about what AI can do for your specifically machine learning before an attack like this happens within the DarkWeb, right? So for the machine learning side of things, on the ActZero side for managed detection and response, we basically have a number of different sources that train our teams to say, okay, well, if we wanted to simulate or we wanted to use a new piece of malware that's out there, we have to understand that the attack surface, what the attackers have and what they're recompiling and what they're selling out there is essentially, changing every 24 hours, right? If you want to go and become an e-crime actor and you want to apply for a job, right? You don't go to LinkedIn and say, hey, I'm looking to hack people. Who's looking to hire me, right? You go on dark web sources where they buy your malware or they, use your services on encrypted messaging. And they essentially try to put you to work as part of a small gang here to work on infiltrating networks, getting data, and getting paid for it, right? And so when you think about the structured and unstructured data here, there's great things that the machine learning can do to collect information, right? So, for example, if you lost your emails and passwords as part of your sign-in data that was stolen from something like LinkedIn breaches, or the Park Mobile, or other types of malware attacks on your partners or CRM provider, right? Those are the kinds of things that when they go to sell it on the dark web is very structured data, right? It's email address, password, right? So in all the ways that we need to find it, right, even if it is sitting on a Korean or Russian or Chinese sort of dark website or with an attack group selling it there, you do have the capability to use that information to see if somebody lost data. It's also a great place to get some binary information, the unstructured data, to say, hey, there's some ransomware for sale here. These little utilities that you see on the screen in the bottom right that are used by these e-crime actors, in terms of sharing, right? So somebody develops a software, they give you a support agreement to say, I'll answer the phone when they ask me for the decryption key, and here's the new malware that's going to work against antivirus. And so that's the kind of thing that you have to be basically, have access to and collect, so that you can essentially detonate it and say, okay, are my defenses actually good against, recently with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, right? Whispergate, or, with the Conti ransomware, campaign, right? And in the, winter of last year, right? Are these new malware samples something that is going to disrupt my existing endpoint, right? And so having the ability to download and do those things is exactly what we do in the managed detection and response field. And ML plays a part in finding that stuff and giving it to us quickly, right? Because it's not like we could deploy an army of people to go, hey, look on the whole dark web and find out if my customer's credentials are gone, or hey, do you know what new malware is out there? Could you just tell me? Like, it's going to be very difficult without a very large indexing program going out and finding this stuff and delivering it to those teams to then run. Of course, in the insurance world, it is different. And so obviously, you're looking for firmographics to try to size, things like premiums and those policies. Zach, walk us through basically what you can get from the dark web before one of these attacks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you're looking at cyber insurance and the way it's been underwritten, so let's call it the 1.0, so to speak. It was underwritten very similar to homeowners insurance, right? And it's done through actuarial science, right? So there's actuarial science and then there's data science, right? Data science is really the driving force behind ML and AI. Actuarial science is really the driving force behind being able to price insurance policies. And if you look at points 1 and 4, those are both heavily in the actuarial process, in addition to, like, how much limit are you buying? A $1 million policy, $2 million policy? So those two elements have actually been pretty consistent. Firmographically, typically you look at revenues, you look at the industry of an organization, you look at maybe the number of employees, or even how much data they store, right? There are correlations there that can be built from an actuarial standpoint and see how that drives losses. Where a lot of the insurance industry has failed to sort of progress, and this is where measured heavily leans on data science and machine learning, is being able to take the current posture, right? Homeowners policies have been collecting data since Benjamin Franklin's time for pricing, right? But if you look at cyber insurance, you have to think about it differently. Historical performance isn't necessarily a predictor of future outcomes. And this is extremely true for cyber insurance because patches are a thing. And there's very little progress in terms of building materials, in terms of how we build homes, right? So invariably, there's obviously a kind of a static pricing mechanism because of that. But with cyber, it's changing every 24 hours. More organizations are getting breached. There's more dark web chatter, so maybe there's some exposed credentials on the web. Another way that you can employ ML is maybe understanding how much risk any one individual in an organization could be to the organization. So one thing that we do is we take a look at the domain, we correlate that domain to maybe some credentials that have been found on the dark web, and then we also try to run that against other maybe personal email addresses. So think about that for a second. There's so much information out there on the dark web. We're actually able to employ machine learning to be able to look at, okay, maybe this business email hasn't been compromised, but where does that business email connect to? Is it on LinkedIn? Is there like an Instagram account attached to it? And then from there, we can find these sort of branches. It really looks like a tree, and see, okay, well, this person in their personal Instagram is using the same password that they use on their Facebook. And if there's some indication that they tend to reuse passwords in that regard or slightly tweaked passwords, there's quite a chance that they're probably using it for their work email, and it could be a question of not if but when. So there's some really interesting things that we could do with machine learning to really understand what the exposure is for an organization and what their probability of loss is. But that really only applies when we can contextualize it with technographic data. So that's number two. So we actually need to understand, okay, well, do you have MFA in place? Do you have segregated backups that are air gapped? Do you have a good patching cadence? A number of variables come into what we deem as the technographic exposure. And then we really run that against what the exposure is in terms of the current threat landscape, what their current threat is in terms of what exposed credentials or information there is about your organization. And then what technology are you employing that maybe makes all of that exposure on the dark web a moot point? And we wrap all that together with the actuarial science and really finding the middle ground between actuarial science and data science to generate a premium. I mean, that's what you would pay when you are a measured insured. Is we thoughtfully go through this, and the reason why a lot of organizations are seeing increases year over year, sometimes 100, 200% year over year in terms of their cyber insurance premium, is because no one did a good job of it before, and they're reeling from that. And so, I'd like to think that we're a little bit more differentiated and nuanced in the way that we evaluate cyber risk and underwrite that.
Yeah, I heard someone once say, as they looked at the technographic exposure, which is basically that laundry list of controls that you ask during your policy negotiation. I had somebody say, what's privilege access management? Are those guys paying off these insurers to make sure they end up on this list? Is that how they're getting in there? And I'm like, it's a little more complicated than that. The ransomware groups that are using the software can reference credentials in a way that it shows up in technographic information. So, yeah, not enough people are paying the privilege access management guys or the MFA guys, and that's why they're really on the top of the list. And so, when you look at these correlative exercises, it's really important to understand that this is not the insurer trying to be punitive to you or make it seem like you're artificially more mature. These are real reasons that you are supposed to maintain your cybersecurity controls. And if you even just think anecdotally about, three of the things you said: offline backups, right? MFA, right? The concept behind a good patching cadence. And you look back at those three attacks, the big ones, right? MFA would have saved Colonial Pipeline. They would have never got access to that ASA. Right, the ability for the patching cadence, right, in the terms of Hafnium, right, anybody who patched their Exchange server really quickly probably didn't see those exposures, even though a lot of people will remember that attack and go, wait a minute, but there was people said that they were attacked or exposed or at least had access to a number of different Exchange servers long before Microsoft had even disclosed that there was a patch, right? And so, those are the kinds of things that, yes, in many cases, the patching cadence wouldn't have helped necessarily at that very specific moment in time. But these attacks have been being carried out for months and months and months after the patch had been released. And so it really is a war of attrition where they're just looking for the people who don't spend the time and energy to go and continually patch. And then they find the opening when you're at your lowest, right? When you just haven't had the time or energy to do it. So always important to make sure that those processes are in place because they do matter from a data science perspective. Now let's get to game day. Okay, that's what you can do before. That's all preparing. Make sure that everything's going good. You negotiated your policy. You have all these things in place. Hopefully, you've tested some of this stuff. You have the concept of your detection and response provider giving you this advanced warning. Okay, you're on the dark web, and we're doing all these other proactive things before something happens. And then what happens when they're actually inside, right? And so I'm going to come back to this triangle that I know everybody loves because they can squint and see how good their eyesight is, but also because this does bring up the kinds of things that are at the top, and those are the things that actually prevent the attack from going forward. These are the things that are blocking stuff in memory. File-based malware detection using machine learning in the last 30 days for ActZero. Of the 99,000 attacks that we blocked, over 30 some odd thousand were responsible, or the source of that detection was machine learning. And so you're getting closer to 30 or 40% of our detections that are relying on those types of things, finding files and blocking them that are malicious, right? And so when you cannot come up with a name for the malware, but you know that it's ransomware, there's something telling you that, and it's usually machine learning, right? In our case, anyway. when you look at things like process behavior analysis, these are sort of linked at the hip, right? Either you used memory or you used a file. Either way, the analysis of that action through the operating system is what's finding and blocking those attacks. Why does this matter? Well, in the case of Kaseya, where you just didn't expect that someone would take over your remote management tool and start deploying ransomware, and heads up to those who use Jamf or any of these other ones that just have not made it to the front of the news page. That doesn't mean that they are invulnerable to this type of thing, right? This could happen to Intune any day now, right? The concept is that the what happens after they actually take over that endpoint and start deploying stuff is to try to beat the detections that you have at the endpoint. And so a lot of those small to medium companies probably still using legacy antivirus that has only a few heuristic detections or signature detections or other things that basically have to look at a new file and say, go to the cloud, analyze the file, and at some point during the day, download a copy of whether this is good or bad. And in many cases, that's anything from a few minutes to a few hours to maybe even a few days in terms of getting back to the endpoint. And so that's way too slow. And so they'll just deploy the ransomware as a service, the new stuff right there. So you need something doing the analysis right on the endpoint, finding out if there's anything that has commonality with ransomware. That's where the machine learning plays, and then it can find and block stuff, right? So that's all well and good. Of course, you also have other things that could have saved you in the ransomware cases that we were talking about. So for example, account takeover identification. If you use the credentials to log into the VPN or the Microsoft cloud and you are not the user in question, then there's going to be some analysis, even on that one log record, that's going to tell you whether this is likely suspicious, almost like fingerprints at a crime scene. They can become geometrically more accurate the more data points that you actually take about that particular print, right? And so as if you have a different browser, if you're coming from a different country, if you change the mail forwarding rule to a Gmail address the second you logged in, you're starting to very likely be an account takeover for that specific system, right? And so machine learning plays an excellent role at being able to find and block those types of things. Why would this have mattered? Well, if you were logging from Kaseya and they used stolen credentials to get access to those super admins, well, then you probably could have found it earlier, or at least the behavior within the logs of the stack that would have told you that that's happening, right? So that's why we have cloud detections at ActZero that work on Amazon and Microsoft and all that other stuff. When you go over to the endpoint, of course, and you start to say, well, what if they were logging into Exchange itself? They weren't logging into Exchange, so this would not have helped you with Afnium at all in terms of account takeover. They just took over with remote code execution, which meant they weren't logging into Exchange as an admin. They were better than an admin, and they could get all your mailboxes without asking, right? So that's the risk of the vulnerability. But in order to do that, they have to deploy a file or a process or a behavior to the endpoint that makes those types of exploits easy to find and block, right? With those other detections. All right. Now, obviously, I talked about three very specific things, three very specific attacks. I like to keep it, rule of three, right? So the ransomware detection, file-based or process-based, that's the Kaseya example, right? Account takeovers, this is the Colonial pipeline. If they used Exchange or the VPN, those logs and that machine learning detection is what you're talking about. And then there's another aspect of this where you could come through Exchange, for example, and look at deploying malicious scripts through the web shell, which the ML is analyzing, that could find and block different types of attack or exploit techniques that they're using to try to launch more attacks directly from that, one access or access they got when they moved through the network from that beachhead from Exchange. And so that's essentially how managed detection and response can leverage the things in those triangles to get real world and sort of block those very popular cyber attacks that are likely to continue. But how is this, something that the Measure team, works with on game day when there's actually an attack in progress?
Yeah, in a very similar way. I mean, MDR does a really effective job of identifying when a ransomware attack is actually occurring and combating that. There's other ways for it to detect, data exfiltration and things of that nature, but a lot of times, depending on how good the actor is or how trained the models are, there's moments where you may not be able to actually detect data exfiltration. We've seen that not so much in the MDR space, but we've actually seen it in the XDR space. But the reason why I bring that up is because when you employ ML and you're an insured of an organization that employs ML to scan the dark web, we can actually see, there's data that's being exfiltrated and it's being leaked on the dark web. So we can actually become apprised potentially of when there's a threat actor inside of your systems before it really blows up, before you have to pay a ransom, before that code actually gets executed to encrypt all of your computers and servers. So being able to partner with an insurance organization that does more than just giving you that claim support when something really does happen and you have no idea what to do. Trying to precurse that with proactive insurance protection, not in the form of just financial, but really in terms of just understanding, are you being attacked? What is your current threat exposure? Having ongoing analysis telling you, hey, this new vulnerability we've detected, or there's some compromised credentials on the web that could potentially affect your organization in a negative way. So really, it's just being a little bit more preemptive and proactive with notifying our insureds that there's things occurring on the dark web that could, potentially lead to a loss.
Yeah, I think it's also important to understand that, for many, many years, I think at least the last three, the policy was really just as simple as asking questions. I mean, I remember when we first signed up for cyber insurance, we had all kinds of other insurance, right? Error and omissions insurance, and for all kinds of professional liability, and different types of premiums for each one, and different types of liability for each one. They'd always need 5 million for this and 10 million for that. And so we would always be shopping for insurance based on, frankly, what our customers wanted, but also to make sure that, if anything happened, we, as part of performance of contract, would have some way of transferring the risk, right? And so when you think about the way that information was collected, right, you just used to apply for the policy and you pay more for it for some of those error and omission policies, right? Very little questions coming back. And in the early days of cyber insurance, very little questions at all, right? Do you have antivirus? Have you run a pen test? Do you have a plan if something goes wrong? Yes, yes, and no, and please and thank you, right? And that was it. And now you start to see people go through these exercises, and they're starting to see very long lists, right? And they're wondering, is there honesty to this, dishonesty to this? It's just a survey, right? Where's the authenticity to what's going on? And so a lot of this technographic information is how insurers themselves are trying to say, look, maybe you don't really know what the answer to do I have privileged access management really is. Is there enough information that I can get about you that'll at least allow me to help understand where you might be relative to the attack surface that's constantly evolving, right? So very interesting ways that ML can go beyond just, questions and answers and firmographics. You can start to see what's actively the posture as per the attacker's perspective that's really helping sort of shape where we're going here. Now, of course, when you try to do your best proactively, find the stuff that's already gone out, make sure you're getting ahead of the problem, putting an MDR that's going to try to stop these attacks in any and all of its forms. You also have the concept that there's work to do after, right? That when we end up in one of these situations, despite, never wanting to be, right, we have to assume and practice the idea that there is going to be a day that we're going to have to go beyond the detection, the contain, the notification, right? We're going to have some follow-on to these types of activities. And so, in the managed detection and response world, I'm probably only sharing maybe number one here, which is that, we help you disclose, we help you communicate, we help you talk about this to your customers or to, a privacy agency or something else, right? And that brings up, where we typically part, right? Remediation about, they got in through Exchange, we patched it or moved to the cloud, and, we blocked it when it was there and it didn't access the data. There's your forensic report. Here's, some additional things we can do at the network layer, et cetera, et cetera. Now you're in this protracted period, right? And this is where this, longer tail story begins. And this is where I'm going to pass it over to Zach, is to say, well, there's all kinds of things that happen after this, right? And how many days does it take to, recover is not the same as how many days are you really suffering from this problem, right? So, when you think about the other things that happen post-attack, Zach, what are those things, and how is Measured involved in using data science for some of these things?
Yeah, absolutely. So, beyond just having to notify the requisite authorities and notifying your clients, there's not a lot of ML behind that, at least not to my knowledge. Maybe I'm running behind on the times here, but certainly being able to employ ML for points 2, 3, and 4, it could be leveraged in a much different way. So understanding business interruption, right? There's actually a lot of forensic accounting that occurs after a loss to understand how much a company should be reimbursed for lost revenues, right? ML could really assist with that instead of having to take on, really tenuous man hours of these accounting firms to figure out all this stuff. ML would be a really effective way of understanding that. And it's actually part of what we leverage in our claims data, so that we're actually separating this out instead of saying, like, how much did this whole thing cost an organization because they were breached? we actually sort of itemize it in a way for the different exposures. We actually push recommendations based on the threat landscape and the exposure of the organization. So if we're detecting that there's been a lot of compromised credentials on the dark web, we could push and say, like, listen, because of this breach, obviously, you should probably force a enterprise-wide password reset of some sort, or you really should look at this email gateway, because the current one that you're using, not all email gateways are created equally, right? Having some knockoff no name that you've never heard of and using Barracuda, for example, it's two very different things, or using Proofpoint. So being able to, receive recommendations on how to better yourself so that this doesn't happen again, this is really effective in, kind of that post-claim scenario. And then obviously, a lot of insurance organizations, after you get a claim, you're axed, right? And they're like, take your business somewhere else. And for us, we really like to pride ourselves on thinking that, after a breach, a lot of organizations, they tend to take this a little bit more seriously. And a lot of organizations become a better risk for an insurance company afterwards, but the insurance industry doesn't really look at it that way. So if you look at the way that we analyze risk and the threat profile for an organization, it's very similar to the way that we look at someone who didn't have a claim, and because of that, we've been able to really step up for these organizations that have had past claims.
Yeah, it'd be like if you're 17 and you're turning left at a yellow and you didn't realize not everybody stops for that and you just get T-boned. Well, you're never going to get shirted again. That's it. That's the end of the road for you in terms of driving. People make mistakes, but they certainly take better precautions and they certainly implement better processes when they come out of these things. And I'd say some of the customers that are in the strongest security position in our MDR service are the ones that came to us from a ransomware attack. They're the ones that implemented the policies. They took the hygiene information very seriously. They had the vulnerability knowledge to now patch much more aggressively, right? And I'm not going to say they spent a tremendous much more amount of time, right? Obviously, that was sort of deployed when they were recovering, is sort of make sure that you put these things back much very and so when you think about the coming back from that scarlet letter of having been attacked, it's important to understand that it doesn't end there, right? You do get better with time, and this isn't something you should wear forever, right? Now, of course, as we start to see questions trickling in, and we're gonna get to those in just a second, guys, but please keep the questions coming. We don't want to just speak to two, and now's the opportunity. Before we do that, I'm going to quickly go through the resources that we are leaving behind. Again, there's an attachments button at the bottom where you can see this stuff. I think then we are going to launch a poll question and then get to the Q&A. And so when we get to the resources here, one of the first things is that we are obviously hosting a resource here from Measured. I don't know, Zach, do you want to talk about how to qualify for cyber insurance asset here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, year over year, the cyber insurance industry has changed really quickly. And so this most up-to-date and current resource will help you, if you don't have cyber insurance, actually qualify for cyber insurance. But this also comes in handy for those of you going through your policy renewals. And this will help you prepare for your renewal. So whether you already have insurance or you don't, definitely look to that resource, understand what the cyber insurance industry is expecting of you. A lot of this is stuff that we actually look at ourselves. So please take advantage of it. And I guarantee you, even if you don't handle your insurance, pass it on to your CFO, pass it on to your director of finance, your CEO, whoever handles the insurance, they'll probably thank you later.
Awesome. Now, for us, we've got 3 assets, right? Sounds like, why so many assets, guys? Couldn't it just be one? They serve 3 different purposes. The first one is just, everybody has a plan until, of course, they get hit in the face. You need to be able to practice your cyber incident response. It's not the type of thing that I think most people take on naturally. They understand that, things may happen, and they try to document an idea of what they could be doing when that happens to try to, communicate and shut down and do things tactically to get rid of something like a cyber attacker that's active in the environment. And they don't realize how just, off their footing they're going to be. This guide basically walks through how to make sure that you understand that communication systems may not be there, that superhero IT person may not be in there, how do you make sure that you evaluate just how far back you can go before you have to go and recover from hopefully something like an offsite backup. The second asset, of course, is where you start to think you're doing enough. That's exactly when you probably should second guess what's going on. So test. But the hyperscale SOC and just what that means in terms of being able to stay ahead of that constantly changing every 24 hours, new malware, new attack, new vulnerability that's coming at your enterprise, and understanding just how you can position yourself against that seemingly daunting task, right? And lastly, just deconstructing what we talked about a little bit on this call, right? We were really talking about ransomware versus AI. It's important to understand how the attackers are moving and changing as well. So this is a nice white paper to explain that ransomware as a service, as the hotline to the bad guy, is really kind of one of the key things to understand here in terms of knowing the 0 days. So while the poll is active now, we'd like to just remind you very quickly about that. We want to be bringing you nice content that is resonating with you. And so, in an effort to make that better, please answer the poll here for our team to understand whether this was useful and the ways that, we can make it better, and what do you want to hear more about that we might be able to cover. With that, hopefully, you can answer throughout. I don't know when they're going to close the poll, but I will say that we're going to turn it over to questions now. And so I will I'll look for one that I can take here. So I have one here that says, how does implementing an advanced AI detection software would affect the insurance prices and coverage? Is there a higher chance of getting more effective insurance policy in that case? Well, I think this is back to Zach's point about, not every product is created equal, right? They don't just say antivirus anymore. They got a list. In that list is something that has probably been vetted against, very modern attacks and successfully come out the other side. And likely that attack, prevention tool is going to be using something like AI to, as part of a, well-balanced diet, block cyber attacks on the endpoint or within, other detection technologies such as your security information and event management system, right? So when you think about AI-enabled software, it's not like they have a button that says, "Is there AI there?" They vet the vendors ahead of time to make sure that they're not asking you for, your Kaspersky antivirus. They're asking you for things that are not on, the nation's blacklist, right? So that's to say that, you're probably going to get from a more mature MDR provider the type of service that probably includes those brand name tools. Certainly we use those types of tools in the service to make sure that, as the insurance policies change, as the attack surface changes, that we're still considered as best of breed, and that we are created at least equal or better than the adversary, right? So that we're not letting stuff through as much as we humanly can. So that's how I'd say it would affect it. And of course, that's not the only thing that goes into your policy calculation. I hope you took that home today from the discussion with Zach. There's a lot of firmographics that go into sizing how much your policy costs and how much coverage you can get. Of course, as people, study loss ratios in classic insurance and try to explain why, it grows 75% or whatever the actual number is, year over year now, you do have a lot of things that go into that, right? How much money they're actually paying out determines how expensive the policy is. What their coverage is going to cover in terms of different sections of the policy is also another thing. And that's where companies like Measured, I think, are taking, significant strides in this 2.0 era to try to get better analytics on just how to size that correctly and not just rely on, actuarial science alone or, the concept of loss ratios by themselves. And Zach, I don't want to steal anything from here. If you got something to say here, please volunteer, and then I'll pass it over to you to grab a question as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, MDR products and endpoint products are not created equally. That's part of the reason why we partnered with ActZero in the first place, actually. An organization that has ActZero and an organization that doesn't have ActZero could see a difference in premium because of that. And really, it's because of that, really split second response that ActZero can take on a particular threat or attack. I mean, in no world, unfortunately, is a human going to be able to be as fast as artificial intelligence in this case. So, while there's definitely room for manual threat hunting, and while that's also very important, it just there's very little that can replace the computing power of an ML driven or an AI driven solution like ActZero. So, at least the way that we look at it, I can only speak for us. We really find that it's important to have software that can react as quickly as ActZero can, and or solutions that have AI built in.
Remind you that are going through the poll, right? To view the poll, please take a look at the vote tab. It is labeled vote, just for those of you that still want to contribute there. I do see one more question. Zach, do you have a question you want to pick out of the pile before I jump on to something?
Yeah, I'll do. I'll read this one out. So, someone asked, "We use an agent to shop our companies. All we get back is that our company's posture is not rated high enough for decent premiums. Should I ask the agent for our profile that got generated by the underwriters?" Yes, that's always useful if they do have the risk report available. But frankly, the vast majority of organizations are not actually generating that kind of report. Um, in response to the company's posture not being rated high enough for decent premiums, I mean, as Adam mentioned, there's a lot of different things. And as I had mentioned earlier in the slide, there's a lot of things that go into generating your insurance premium. But what I can say is that everybody looks at it differently. So, whether you're using an agent or, if you need to contact, we can even have a chat separately to discuss this. But, we do look at things in a bit more unique fashion. So, really, every company is different. This may not be the answer you want to hear. And it may sound like I'm trying to get off easy, but really, it's just the reality of the insurance industry.
So not as easy as just bundling home and auto. It's a little bit, a little bit more exciting than that. Definitely. Okay, I will try to pick another question here. Best way to train users and collaborators on ransomware attacks. So first, it's important to understand, I think that cybersecurity awareness training, sort of gets this eye roll sometimes, and you see companies, try to build really cute content around this to train people on, any and everything, right? Like how to identify a phishing attack, very popular. How not to leave your password on your forehead, things that I think your users would be embarrassed to say, all right, yeah, I get it, thank you. I wouldn't do that, and then in a pinch they probably do. But it's not just them, right? I think if you look at those 3 attacks, right, they were all ransomware attacks, right? They logged in using credentials stolen, not in of the company, but in of the vast ecosystem of SaaS products that you can steal credentials from in Colonial Pipeline, logged into a VPN that they had forgotten about, and then moved through the environment undetected, and then got data and then copied it and didn't do anything bad until they encrypted the software, right? So who and how did we train to survive that? I think what they did extremely well was train their collaborators, their suppliers, and themselves on the recovery process, on building back as fast as humanly possible, to the credit of that company that they actually built faster than the actual recovery tool. And keep in mind, they did a great job at doing that. And how they disclosed, they kept everybody informed, they told everybody what was happening. And that had a fallout, I think, that most would probably expect, but not to that magnitude where they actually raised gas prices. But the truth is, in that exam, right, they trained on the BCP, on the recovery, right? Nobody got phished, right? No one went through the analytics, in the SOC. No one fell asleep, right? You didn't bypass the human intuition here. And so the right way to collaborate with your suppliers, and certainly with your staff, is to invite them into this understanding that there's going to be incident response. What to do when something happens. It's a fire drill, right? So I think that that's a very key thing to focus on, specifically when you think about something like Colonial Pipeline, and say, where should we focus the energy? Focus like they focused on recovery. And of course, you can't let it slide, right? You need the risk transfer, right? You need the insurance, all right? You do need the idea that you're going to put in these proactive measures and the detections and responses, because you don't want to be in a recovery state. You just want to practice like you're in a recovery state, right? And then the other thing I'd say is that not everybody necessarily needs to know what ransomware is. I mean, I try to deconstruct it for my niece and nephew who are 5, but that just is what I read them when they go to sleep. It's not like everybody needs to know all the particulars about how they're getting in. It helps to give small essays or small awareness, small newsletters out to people so they can kind of say, oh, okay, I know what ransomware is. I know where it's coming from. I know how it gets here. Maybe I should stop imagining that it's going to be, the use of my son's Fortnite thing next to them, right? So if we didn't get to your questions, we'll try to reach out to you directly. You can always contact us or friends at Measured. And thank you very much for attending, everybody. We really appreciate it. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks, everyone.